Hello, welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 20 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll understand what stored procedure return values are, the difference between stored procedure return values and output parameters, and finally, when to use output parameters over return values. In part 18 of this video series, we have seen the basics of stored procedures, and in part 19, we have seen how to create stored procedures with output parameters. If you haven't watched these two parts, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with this session. Now, let's first understand what return values are. Whenever you execute a stored procedure, it returns an integer status variable. Usually, a 0 indicates success and a non-zero indicates failure. Let's understand what we mean by this practically. Okay, so we are in SQL Server Management Studio, and in the Object Explorer, okay, if you open the programmability folder, you should see stored procedures folder, within which I have got a stored procedure sp get name by id. We have created this stored procedure in the previous session. Okay, now if I want to execute this stored procedure, I can just right click on that and select execute stored procedure. Now if you look at the name of the stored procedure, sp get name by id, okay, we want to get the name of the employee by providing his ID. So if I give ID of 1, then I should get Sam back. Okay, so let's provide the value for ID, which is 1, and when I click OK, look at this, the stored procedure gets executed. I get Sam's name back, which is the expected result. But you look at this, we have a return value as well, and that's an integer, and it is 0 here. So 0 return value, usually 0 indicates success and a non-zero indicates failure. So from this we have understood that when we execute a stored procedure, we get an integer status variable back. Okay, and if that integer status variable is 0, then the stored procedure executed successfully, and non-zero indicates a failure. Alright, with that, now let's try and understand the difference between these return values and output parameters. In part 19 of this video series, we have seen a lot about output parameters. So in this session, we'll talk about the differences between output parameters and return values. Now if you look at the procedure that I have written here, this procedure is called sp get total count of employees. Okay, so in this table I have got 10 employees, so I want to get the total count of these employees. So we are creating a stored procedure for that. sp get total count of employees, and we have an input parameter at total count. Okay, an output parameter at total count. So this is a stored procedure with this we are creating with this output parameter. And what are we doing? We are initializing that output parameter with the count function. Okay, and let's create that practically. Okay, I want to get the total count of employees. So what we can do, we can create the stored procedure, create procedure sp get total count. Okay, let's call it get total count 1. And obviously to get that total count, to receive that total count, let's use an output parameter at total count, and this is going to be of type integer, and it's going to be output parameter as begin end. Now what we want to do, we want to select the total count of employees and initialize this output parameter with that count. So select at count is equal to count of ID from TBL employee table. Okay, so let's execute the stored procedure. Let's create this stored procedure. So when we execute, the stored procedure got created successfully. So we have created the stored procedure now. Now this is stored procedure with output parameter, and if we want to execute the stored procedure with output parameter, we have to first declare an integer variable and then pass the integer variable to the stored procedure with an output keyword. You have to tell this procedure that this is an output parameter, and then we select the value that is returned back into this output parameter. Okay, so let's do that. Declare, let's call at total and integer. So we want to execute the stored procedure, so which is nothing but sp get total count, and we want to pass this this variable here and use the keyword out, so that this variable will receive the value. And finally, what we want to do, you can either print it or select it. It's up to you what you want to do. So let's print it here in this case. Okay, so when we execute this, we should get number 10 back. Okay, which is the case. So what we have done now, we have created a stored procedure with an output parameter, and which will receive the total number of employees, and we have executed that stored procedure which will print the total number of employees. Okay, now let's go ahead and do the same thing using return values. Okay, so we are creating this procedure. If you look at this procedure is using the return value. Okay, create procedure sp get total count of employees 2 as begin, and if you look at this, we have a return keyword here now, and there is a bracket, there are pair of brackets here, and within that brackets we are saying select count of ID from employees, meaning we are trying to count all the employees here. Okay, so we get 10 employees, so we are selecting number 10 and we are returning that 10. Okay, so this procedure, what it's doing, it's returning the total count of employees, and this procedure, it does essentially the same but in a different way using output parameters. Okay, so let's create the second procedure. So let's call this sp get total count 2, and we are not going to have an output parameter now. Instead, what we are going to do, we are just going to return the total count. Okay, but you should have a bracket here. Okay, so this pair of brackets ensures this statement gets executed first, and whatever is the output, that is returned back using this return keyword. So let's execute this procedure now. So we have that procedure created. Now if you want to execute that stored procedure, okay, look at what you are doing here. You are creating a variable of type integer, and then when you execute this stored procedure using this execute keyword, it returns a value back. So we are taking that value and initializing this variable, and finally what we are doing, we are selecting it, or you can print it. Okay, so let's execute sp get total count 2. To execute that, obviously we need a variable of type integer. Execute this one, sp get total count 2, and then what we want to do, when this stored procedure returns a value, I want to initialize this variable and finally print that. So obviously when I execute this, we should get 10. Okay, so now if you look at this, I am able to print the total number of employees in my organization, using output parameters as well as using return values. Okay, now let's look at an example where return status variables cannot be used but output parameters can be used. Okay, alright, so now let's say I want you to write a stored procedure which gives the name of an employee when I give it an ID. So if I pass ID into the stored procedure, it has to give the name of the employee to me back. Okay, so obviously your ID is an input parameter, whereas name is an output parameter. Okay, and what we are doing, we are initializing this name output parameter with the name of the employee from employee table, where ID is equal to whatever ID we are passing in. Okay, and again this should be pretty straightforward. We have spoken extensively about output parameters in part 19 of this video series. So if you're new to output parameters, please watch that video first. Okay, so let's create the stored procedure sp get name by ID 1. Okay, so create procedure, let's call this sp get name by ID 1, and this procedure needs to have two parameters. When we pass in ID, we will get the name back, so we need an integer parameter at ID integer, and we also need an output parameter which can receive the name of the employee back. So at name, since name is a string, it's nvarchar of 20, and this is an output parameter, so we need to use the output keyword as begin. And what we want to do, we want to select at name is equal to name from TBL employee table where ID is equal to @ID that we are passing in. Okay, so let's execute the stored procedure. Okay, so we got the stored procedure created now. Now let's execute this. To execute this stored procedure, obviously we need a variable to receive the name of the employee. So let's call this @name, and this is going to be of type envarchar of 20. And what we want to do is execute sp_get_name by ID. Okay, so if you want to execute this stored procedure, you have to pass in ID. So let's say we will pass 1, and we want the name of the person back. We know that we will receive the name into output parameters, so we should have a variable which will receive that. So I have created a variable for that, pass that here, and you have to use the out keyword, otherwise this output parameter will not receive the value. And finally, what we want to do, we want to say maybe name is equal to whatever this variable has. Okay, so let's execute the stored procedure. So when we execute that, name is Sam. Okay, so we are able to achieve, we are able to retrieve the name of an employee by passing in ID. ID is an input parameter, whereas name is an output parameter. So our stored procedure is capable of returning the name of an employee, which is of type envarchar. Let's try to do the same thing using output parameters. So we have executed the stored procedure with output parameter. Now let's create a stored procedure which returns the name of the person given we provide it an ID. Okay, the same kind of a procedure but using return values. Okay, so if you look at this, we are creating procedure, we are having an ID parameter, input parameter, and look at this, what it's doing, it's selecting the name of the employee from TBL employee table where ID is equal to @ID, and that has to be inside this bracket. So whatever this query brings back, that is being returned back. Okay, so let's create that stored procedure. So create procedure sp_get_name by ID, let's call that 2, and we will have only an input parameter, no output parameter. As begin, okay, select, instead of using the output parameter, what we will do, we will execute this one. Okay, this query gets evaluated, which selects the name of the employee for the provided ID, and we finally return that back. Okay, so let's create the stored procedure. So we have the stored procedure created, and obviously if you want to execute that, since we are using return values, you create a variable of type envarchar, and you will say, okay, that variable is equal to whatever is the result of the stored procedure. Okay, so let's do that here. Okay, so we declared this variable, and what I want to say is @name is equal to execute that stored procedure. It's not 1, it's going to be 2 because this is the procedure that we want to execute, and let's pass 1 as the ID of the employee, and let's execute this and see what happens. Okay, so look at this. Conversion failed when converting the envarchar value Sam to data type integer. Now if you remember, at the beginning of this video session, we have spoken that whenever you execute a stored procedure, it returns an integer status variable. Okay, now this return value here, when we execute this, the return value of the stored procedure should always be an integer. Okay, a value of 0 indicates success and non-zero indicates failure. Okay, but what did we do here? We are trying to return an envarchar type. Though you are able to create this stored procedure successfully, at runtime what's going to happen, ID is equal to 1, we are passing 1 here, so for 1 the name is Sam. Sam is the name of the employee, so it tries to convert Sam into an integer because the return value of a stored procedure is an integer. Okay, you cannot convert Sam word into an integer, and it fails, and that's why we get this error. So keep in mind, return values, you can use return values only to return an integer. Okay, and that too only one value. Let us say I have a scenario where I want to return the name and gender of an employee. Can I do that with return values? No, you cannot. First of all, they are string data types, so you cannot do that even if they are integers. Let's say, for example, I want to return maybe the pin code and the age of a person. Both of them, let's say they are integers. Can I do that with return values? You cannot, because a return value is only one value. Okay, but can I do the same thing with output parameters? Absolutely. You can return any number of values with output parameters and any data type, whereas return values has to be integer and you can only return one value. Okay, so those are the differences between. So if you look at the differences between return values and output parameters, return status value only integer data type, whereas output parameters can be any data type, because you have the flexibility of specifying the the data type for output parameters. Look at this: when you create an output parameter, you specify the data type, but you don't have that flexibility with return values. So they are always integers, whereas output parameters any data type, return values only one value, they can return only one value, but output parameters you can return any number of values. And usually, in general, at least I use return status value to convey success or failure of a stored procedure, especially when we are dealing with nested stored procedures. Okay, and if you really want to return values like name, count, age, etc., we should be using output parameters, not return status variables values. Alright, on this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.